Hi there, BookTube. I don't normally like doing single book review videos because I think my channel, people come to sort of see a selection of books and, you know, because one or two titles might be of interest to them. But I rather feel I have no option otherwise to tag this on to a video talking about other books is going to dominate that video because I'm going to talk for a reasonable amount of time about this. But also I think those other books will be lessened by being part of that video. So I'm going to start off with the rating, get that out of the way. I thought it would be 2 stars while I was reading it. I would say this was a buddy read with Brian over at Bookish, and I will post the link to his review of this. But actually, sort of considering it after I'd finished, I'm giving it 1 star. Now, you might think that's almost inevitable because of the type of books I like, and I will also post the link to my original video as to why I picked this book up to read in the first place. I did hope I wouldn't have to hate read it, but I kind of did. So yeah, I'll post the link to my video as to why I felt I had to read this, but for those who don't fancy watching that 6-minute video, maybe it's longer than 6 minutes, I can't remember, but anyway, it's basically because I have titled one of my books that I am now submitting for publishing to echo this, and it's called Solipsistic Conversations with Close Friends. I'm not going to mention that book again until possibly right at the very end of this review. Okay, so the first thing to say is that this book has 4 main characters. We have Bobby and Francis, who are students at university in Ireland. They formerly had a lesbian affair but are now just best mates. And the other 2 characters, one is called Melissa, who is a 37-year-old photographer and a published author of someone who's had sort of art photo books done. And she comes to see Bobby and Francis do their spoken word performance poetry one night. Francis writes all the poetry, but Bobby brings the sort of the star power in performance to it. Melissa approaches them afterwards, says, "Look, I'd really like to do a profile of you. We need some photos, and I'll write up a story." And the 4th character is her husband, Nick, who is a reasonably successful actor, and they become close friends, the 4 of them. None of them are likeable, and I'll take a deep dive into why that is. Now, books don't have to have likeable characters for the reader to still enjoy them, but it's very hard when there's no shade of light amongst any of the characters to like it. But that's, you know, the mere fact that the characters are unlikable is not the reason that I didn't get on with this book. There are several reasons, and I'm going to start with the language, the style. It's not literary language. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. You don't have to write in a literary style. You can write in a very stripped down style or a conversational style. But there are inconsistencies with her style that sort of throw into question exactly which of those she's after. So just to say that I have a sort of yellow legal pad full of page numbers to back up all the arguments I'm going to make. So the first thing to say is that she uses repetition quite a lot. Now, there's nothing wrong with repetition. You know, when a word sort of jars with you that, oh, I've heard this recently, you know, it can have a powerful sort of literary effect. But the problem is the word she chooses to repeat. So this is the very first page of the book. Melissa used a big professional camera. And then at the bottom of the page, I was a big fan. And then on page 5, i.e. 2 pages later, we get, he had a big handsome face. So she's used the word big 3 times in the first 3 pages. And as I say, it might be a deliberate thing, but when you've got such a sort of banal and insipid word like big, which is sort of almost emptied of meaning, it has no dimensions, even though it's suggesting dimensionality, the repetition doesn't work. I mean, usually when you're repeating words, It's either what jars and makes it stand out as repetition and draws the reader's attention to why the author might have done that. Can be one of two things. One is the sound of the word, and that repeated sound. So like an author like David Peace, for example. So that can be sort of how it sort of becomes, reveals itself to the reader. Or the other is it's an unusual word, or a word used in an unusual context, and that context is repeated for this word. But you don't do it with words like big, or another one that she does is the word nice, which to me is the most unliterary of literary words. It's a word that has almost no meaning, and if it does have meaning, it has the sort of context of being deliberately underplaying something. So it's not beautiful, it's nice, which sort of seems to imply some sort of criticism. Anyway, so the two, page 198, 199, she uses it here. He shrugged. He was still touching me underneath the coat. It was nice. This is a sexual touching. She's wearing his coat with nothing on underneath it. He's got his hand under her coat on her flesh, and she's gone, it was nice. And then on the next page, I laughed. He sat up a little to watch me laughing. It's nice, he said. It gives me an opportunity to enjoy being so inadequate. So that's quite a big concept. He's sort of saying, I like being inadequate, or you make me feel inadequate, but that turns me on. These are quite big, important psychological themes. But he's introduced it by, it's nice. And then finally, why I come back to the notion of these repetitions are not... They're certainly not literary. I don't think they're devices consciously employed. I actually think it's lazy writing. And the editor's missed it as well. Because on page 6, so again, 2 pages into the novel, we get this line. She's drunk. The room was spinning repetitively in short consecutive spins. Well, any sort of half-decent writer would use the word revolve or rotate. You wouldn't repeat the concept of spin. So that's her sort of word repetition. But it's more than that. This is a stripped down, possibly conversational style of writing. And so there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But every so often she lobs in these sort of great literary flourishes, these hand grenades. Only they're hand grenades without fuses. Now, the two aspects of that is, one is she drops in names like Lacan, Baudrillard, Zizek. So they're all sort of great, intellectual thinkers. And there's nothing really wrong with that. I do it myself, but there's a difference in how I do it and how she's done it. You literally get the name, Lacan, and that's it. It's something like, you'll either write, so she and Bobby are at odds with each other. Bobby has got off in a huff. So Frances composes an email, blah, 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 and she says, and you'll either write back to me to this email to discuss Lacan, or you won't write at all. And that's it. That's the only mention of Lacan. In my book, I'm not sure if I've got it here. Expert preparation for a video, as you can see. So in my book, Stories We Tell Our Children, I also refer to Lacan, but I take the trouble of spending 2 or 3 lines to explain why I've opted to bring him up in the story, what its relevance is, what the resonance to one of his particular theories is within my book. I don't just name drop the name, which is what she does. She also does it with Baudrillard, another sort of French academic thinker. But she provides slightly more meat on the bone for this reference. I could see a care label bunched inside the seam of the slip she was wearing, which destroyed the effect of reality for me, although the slip and its care label were undoubtedly themselves real. I concluded that some kinds of reality have an unrealistic effect, which made me think of the theorist Jean Baudrillard, though I'd never read his books, and these were probably not the issues he was his writing addressed. So she's brought in Baudrillard, offered a theory that links it back to the sentiment that she's trying to express for Frances, the character Frances. But then she sort of undermined it by sort of saying, well, I've never read Baudrillard, this probably isn't a good representation of his theory at all. So I find these sort of literary references or intellectual references don't work at all. Rooney has talked about her sort of leanings towards Marxism or leanings into Marxism, and that is dealt with in the book. Both Frances and Bobby seem to have sort of Marxist leanings, but they're done in very sort of superficial ways. So here's one treatment of it. Over dinner, we exchanged some of the details about our lives. I explained that I wanted to destroy capitalism and that I considered masculinity personally oppressive. Nick told me he was, quote, literally speech marks in the book, basically a Marxist, and he didn't want me to judge him for owning a house. It's this or paying rent forever, he said. Okay, so that's, Frances has proclaimed herself to be anti-capitalist, wants to bring capitalism down. Next paragraph. I became infatuated with the house he lived in, how immaculate everything was, and the coolness of the floorboards in the kitchen. They had an electric coffee grinder in the kitchen, and Nick bought whole bean coffee and then put small portions in the grinder before breakfast. So she's not that anti-capitalist and anti-free market then. Other examples. So I mentioned earlier when she was wearing Nick's jacket and nothing else underneath. So they're talking about the jacket, I think, before they got to the stage of the touching. We were still looking at each other in the mirror. He stood behind me and lifted the coat open with his fingers. I watched him looking at me. It was, he said, I don't remember how much it was. €1,000? What? No, 200 or 300 maybe. I wish I had money, I said. So again, not really that anti-capitalist. And then finally, we do get these strangely literary flourishes, which again gainsay the idea that she's resorting to a stripped-down style as a deliberate, authorly decision. As I say, it's a perfectly legitimate decision to write your book in a stripped-down language style. John McGregor, all his books are like that. And then she throws in something like this. She's a student, okay? I would open 15 tabs on my web browser while producing phrases like epistemic rearticulation and operant discursive practices. Now, I know she's sort of satirising this sort of academic jargon that doesn't mean anything. But to throw it into a book where it has resolutely set its face against anything sort of overly artistic and literary, it just jars. It doesn't work. Now, I will say there was one piece of writing throughout the whole book that I actually liked, but it's the exception to the rule that proves the rule. She goes, I hadn't really been looking up at Melissa at the time, and Nick hadn't seen her come through the doorway. It captured something intimate that had never really happened, something elliptical and somehow fraught. I saved it to my downloads folder to look at later on. So I do like this line where it captures something intimate that had never really happened, something elliptical and somehow fraught. So she can do it, but she chooses not to, which is fine. But then she can't help herself that the writer, the literary writer in her, it bursts through, almost like Alien, the movie. And that undermines the consistency. Once you take an artistic decision for your style, you have to stick with it within each book. I mean, you can change it from book to book to book. But within a book, you have to be consistent, and she isn't. And it's not just sort of academic, intellectual, literary references. There are these other, as I say, sort of hand grenades thrown in sort of randomly. But, they're hand grenades without fuses because they're so random. You question, why have you opted to bring this up here? What's its significance? Why don't you go on to talk about it and develop the idea so that the reader can, grab hold and appreciate the resonance? They're just logged in. So, for example, page 7, you will see, I don't write in books. I do write in non-fiction books that are pertinent to what I'm researching. But I don't write in my fiction books. I might dog-ear a page to remember. or like here, I might write down the page number so I can go back and refer to it. But this book, you know, particularly the first fifth of it, I mean, there's loads of notes I made. I mean, it did sort of slacken off towards the end. At some points, I found myself line editing this book. It was quite extraordinary. So she writes this. When we were 17, we had to attend a fundraising dance in the school assembly hall with a partially broken disco ball casting lights on the ceiling and on the barred up windows. And then it talks about what Bobby was wearing at the do. So I was interested. A partially broken disco ball. Okay, why do you say it's broken? I assume she means some of the sort of silver tiles are off, or maybe there's a dent in it, or it hangs skew for what, you know. And if that's the case, it's going to do interesting things to the light reflecting off it. But we don't get any of that. Is it left to our imagination? Possibly. I mean, it was left to my imagination in the sense of I wanted more, I demanded more. So to me, it just becomes a random detail thrown in without any context other than it's within the context that she was attending a school fundraising ball. But the interesting part, which is this, you know, disco ball that's not functioning properly, she doesn't develop, she doesn't do anything with it. It's throwaway. And again, still at this dance, we could hear the music buzzing through the floorboards. Fine, nothing wrong with that. But the simile she resorts to, like a ringtone belonging to someone else. You don't need the someone else. If you're hearing music buzzing through the floorboards, it's already distant. Like a ringtone. So the implication is like a ringtone that's over there. It's quite clearly not your ringtone. So that's redundant. It's tautologous in a way. Again, still early on in the book. Mostly Nick stayed quiet while Melissa asked us questions. She made us laugh a lot, but in the same way you might make someone eat something when they don't fully want to eat it. I just think that's a really clumsy simile. She made us all laugh a lot, but in the same way you might make someone eat something when they don't fully want to eat it. Instead of saying fully don't want to eat it, you could just say which you might make someone eat grudgingly or reluctantly. That's all you need to make it work. I'm not the most dinner party person either, I said. That's just clumsy to my ear. So if this is conversational, and it is because it's a dinner party conversation, I'm not the most dinner party person either. It's just a bit grammatically clumsy. I'm not saying people might not talk like that, but it's a bit harsh on the ear. Same page. I felt giddy, and now that Bobby had gone quiet, I kept laughing at nothing on my own. I know what she's trying to say. That she's sort of, because Bobby's gone, or gone quiet, she's sort of left in a sort of isolated silence, or nothingness, but she keeps laughing. But the putting together in one phrase, I kept laughing at nothing, that's fine, that works, on my own. That's sort of what overcooks it and kills the goose. This simile. When we came out the theatre, it was raining again. I felt pure and tiny like a newborn baby. Newborns don't feel anything. They, you know, if you're saying they're pure, well, that's an adult sort of judgment on them, not the baby. The baby's not feeling pure, and the baby doesn't feel tiny. So she's saying inside. She's trying to say inside she feels pure and tiny, but actually, in the context of applying it to a newborn baby, both those are external judgments cast on the baby, so that doesn't work. And then she goes, same paragraph, Philip put up his umbrella and we walked towards his bus stop while I sort of grinned maniacally at nothing, again at nothing, and touched my own hair a lot. Well, we all have unconscious gestures, but the point is they're unconscious. She's aware she's touching her hair as she's grinning maniacally. So either it doesn't work because it should be an unconscious gesture, or she's doing it performatively, more of which are none. And another sort of clumsy construction of a sentence. I thought, I felt like I was playing a video game without knowing any of the controls. Now, I'm of a generation where I've never played video games, so I wouldn't know the controls, but I've never had a dream or an association of being confronted by a situation in which I've got a joystick, if that's what they're even called, and I don't know what the buttons are. Whereas, people who've grown up on consoles, on Xbox and PlayStation, they know what the buttons do. Now, even if they've got a new game, the buttons still function in approximately the same way. Yeah, they might have to work out that this button means retreat rather than that button, but to not know all the buttons, yeah, it just sort of didn't work for me. And I started this, and I've rather veered off from it by talking about these sort of hand grenades, these sort of random things, undeveloped things that she throws in. And here's an example. The next evening, Nick and I went to see an Iranian film about a vampire. And then she talks about Bobby kissing her. And I'm thinking, oh, that's interesting. You've got an Iranian film, which is unusual in the UK or in Ireland here, enough in itself. But it's a sort of Iranian vampire film. So you think, well, is that commenting on the political situation in Iran? But it's, again, we're told that this is what they've gone to see. But then it's in total isolation. It's not attached to anything. It has no resonance. How does it apply to these characters? And there's a situation which I also want to return to as part of the character work later, but I felt it was instructive here. Frances has a desperate need to talk to Bobby, who's sat on the sofa in their shared flat watching a documentary about the Algerian Civil War and the Algerian Liberation campaign. It was overlaid with a voiceover explaining the role of the French military. I said, sometimes I just feel, and Bobby placed a finger over her lips and said, Frances, I'm watching. Now, I will return to that, but in the context of here, why... We know that Bobby has these sort of political pretensions and aligned to the communists, but why is Algeria, the Algerian Civil War and War of Liberation, why is that so significant to her that she won't even pause it to hear the emotional crying out of her friend? If we're given an idea of what it means to Bobby, how it resonates with her, then maybe, but we're not. So I think those are all the examples of why I feel this is not a well-written book. We've got the word repetitions of banal words. We've got random, uncontextualised references to real-life thinkers and philosophers and this and that. We've got some terrible examples of idioms and similes, which, in the case of the console one, felt quite excluding of my generation, more of which are none. And we've got, sudden bursts of literary sort of writing when it's, to all intents and purposes, a book that's stripped down in style. So it's all inconsistent, I feel, and betrays... I mean, this was her debut novel, but it's things an editor really could have picked up. So that's the style of the novel. Now we're going to come to the characters. And I feel the character work is very inconsistent. So Frances is sort of the main focus of this book. And she describes herself as having no personality, being plain, in appearance, and yet she admits to having an ego. Now, I conceded to Brian in our discussion over Voxer that you can have no personality but still have an ego, because she is full of self-loathing. But that involves having an ego because she's self-obsessed. She's, filled with self-loathing. Therefore, she's looking inwardly and at herself as much as she's looking outwardly. And that in itself is a manifestation of ego. And I conceded that point to Brian. But the problem I had with having no personality and yet having an ego is where she asserts her ego positively, not in self-loathing, but in putting herself forward, trying to stamp her imprint. And the examples of that are... So this is the first part of that equation. This is about her self-loathing. I certainly couldn't tell her what I found most enduring about him, which was that he was attracted to a plain and emotionally cold woman to me. That is the main character we are asked to be empathic with, and it's not a great ride for the reader. Attracted to plain and emotionally cold women like me. And she also says, I wanted to be hard and frictionless. So that implies that she's unemotional, that nothing can get to her, but we'll come back to that. So this is the assertion of ego that counters, that sort of counters this idea that she has no personality. I lay back on the bed laughing at nothing. Again, she's always laughing at nothing. He hung the coat up. I lifted one of my legs in the air and crossed it over the other one slowly. I would miss dominating you in conversation, I said. Well, that to me is an utter statement of one's ego, that you want to be superior and dominate your sexual partner. So I don't buy this that, you know, she has no personality, because she has enough ego to project herself forward. So that is part of Frances. The other part is, as I say, she says, I wanted to be hard and frictionless. So as part of having no personality, apparently she has no emotions. This is a complete, you know, in the same way as I've just said about her ego, this is complete nonsense that she has no emotions. She'd like to think she does. So there's going to be several examples of this. I felt a growing sense of dread, a thin and physical dread that began in my shoulders as I listened. At first, I couldn't figure out what it was. It felt like dizziness, or the strange blurry sensation that precedes being violently ill. I tried to think of what might be causing it, things I had eaten, or the car journey earlier. It was only when I remembered the night before that I knew what it was. I felt guilty. I mean, to me, this is the most bizarre construction. You know, first of all, she does have an emotion, but in order to get to it, she has to eliminate physical causes such as car sickness or overtiredness or drunk, you know, whatever. And then she realises right at the end of this process of elimination, oh, it is an emotion. It's an emotion called guilt. I mean, I find that utterly bizarre that she could be so self-deluded that her instant analysis is to go to physical causes of sensation, not emotional ones. So she'd like to think that she's emotionless, but there she's led to an undeniable conclusion, an incontestable conclusion, that it was the emotion of guilt. Okay, next one. And this is true of all the characters, not just Frances. She smiled and congratulated the winner, and then the bell had gone and we'd collected our books. Instead of going to class, I'd locked myself in a cubicle in the upstairs bathrooms and cried, an emotion, until I heard the lunchtime bell. Cried until my lungs hurt and my face was rubbed raw. I couldn't explain what made me feel that furious, an emotion, consuming misery. But sometimes, even still, when I thought about that election, my eyes filled up stupidly with tears. So this is about an election at school that Bobby was running as a candidate, and Bobby lost the election, and Frances, for some reason, takes on all this heavy emotion that her friend didn't win. And she's still pondering on it as she's now getting on for an adult at university. But she says, I couldn't explain what made me feel that furious, consuming misery. But sometimes, even still, when I thought about that election, my eyes fill up stupidly with tears. She has done no work on these emotions. She has done no work to try and understand and get to grips with them and grapple with why she might feel with that. What about seeing her friend defeated has brought all this on? We can see it as a reader because it's not exactly sophisticated stuff, analytical stuff. But she won't do the work on herself, and neither will any of the characters. Now, Frances and Bobby are in their early 20s, so they get a bit of a pass. But when Nick and Melissa refuse to do work on themselves and they're nearing their 40s, that won't wash. as interesting enough characters to want to follow their fates throughout this book. So more examples of this sort of not doing the work on themselves. I tried to make myself think about things logically. Anxiety was just a chemical phenomenon producing bad feelings. Feelings were just feelings, they had no material reality. If I had ever been pregnant, then I was probably miscarrying anyway. So what? The pregnancy was already over, and I didn't need to consider things like Irish constitutional law, the right to travel, my current bank balance, and so on. So she had what she thought was a pregnancy, but turned out to be endometriosis, which is a really nasty condition that can't really be treated, and should arouse sympathy or at least empathy in the reader. But the way it's treated here, it doesn't. But that's not really what I want to talk about. So she's, the rational, logical part of her brain is trying to relegate feelings to chemical reactions. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that analysis. Feelings were just feelings. They had no material reality. That may be true in a sort of narrow biochemical sense. But feelings exert, consequences and reactions on material reality. Feelings can drive our decision making. Feelings can drive our obsessions. Feelings can stop us functioning during the day because we're depressed or we're vengeful and trying to think how to get revenge. Feelings are not immaterial other than the sense that ideas are immaterial. Feelings are immaterial on that level. But they have an effect on the material world. They guide us constantly in our movements and our behaviours and our actions through the material world. So you can't say that they have no materiality, because they do. Again, do some bloody work on yourself. Okay, again. They thought you were miscarrying a pregnancy, she said. That's kind of intense, isn't it? Is it? I don't know. I don't know what to feel about it. Okay, well, if you thought you were pregnant and thought you might have lost the baby and then been told you've got a life condition called endometriosis, you shouldn't really be tossing off the line, I didn't know what to feel about it. Just, as I say, these are not characters they're not putting in the work, so why should we put in the work? And again, she's having spent Christmas with her mother in the country, away from Bobby. Quote, I wanted to tell her that I missed her. That was what I'd started to say or thought about saying. So she does have feelings. She missed Bobby, her best friend. But, interestingly, that's what I had started to say or thought about saying, but she doesn't carry it through. She doesn't execute it. This book is called Conversations with Friends. And I have to say that they're half conversations, and that the friends or the friendship seems rather grudging, more of which are none. But this notion of conversations, they're not really carried out to the full. Sometimes you don't seem that enthusiastic, I said. He laughed, which wasn't really the sympathetic response I expected. He looked down. His face was a little flushed. Do I not? He said. I felt hurt then and said, I talk a lot about how much I want you and how much fun I'm having, and it's never really reciprocal. I feel like I don't fulfill you a lot of the time. So heavy stuff, right? He lifted his hand and started rubbing the back of his neck. Oh, he said, okay, well, I'm sorry. I am trying, If there are things I'm doing wrong, I want you to tell me. In a slightly pained voice, he said, you're not doing anything wrong. It's me, I'm just awkward. Nick is presented as this incredibly submissive male, and he's always asking Frances, once they're in a relationship, are you okay? Is that, does that feel nice? Is that is my hand in the right place? Do you like that? Is there anything you need? I'm not doing it wrong, am I? But those sentiments speak to me. He's an actor, remember. They speak to me of things that he's picked up, a script that he's picked up, not necessarily an actual script, but because actors have to rely on what the person they're acting with in a scene what they say, you know, for their cues. He knows all the cues, and he knows the lines that he's expected to toss back to those cues. And that's what all of this sounds like. You know, she says in one place, "Look, I'm really sorry I overreacted." He goes, "Well, no, I'm sorry I underreacted." No one talks like that. No mea culpa ever takes that. I mean, mea culpas are very hard to find anyway, because people are so, I'm right, you're wrong, you need to bend, you need to retreat, you need to give ground. But when there is a mea culpa, it doesn't take the form of, "Look, I'm sorry I overreacted." No, I underreacted. No one ever says they underreact. That, you know, it's bizarre. That example that I gave about the Algerian documentary, you know, Francis has come in and says, "I really need, you know, I'm feeling something right now, I really need to talk about it." But there's no conversation now because Bobby's watching the Algerian Civil War documentary. It's funny, and this is between Bobby and Francis. It's funny, I think I've learned more about your feelings in the last 20 minutes than the last 4 years. They're best friends, they were at school together. You know, yes, we all have secrets, yes, we all have parts of ourselves that stay hidden. But again, if you were having proper conversations throughout your friendship, throughout your relationship, and they were lovers as well, let's not forget, you know, you wouldn't say that sentence. You would have held the conversations previously. These conversations that need to take place don't take place. They might begin, but then they're sort of cut short, or they drift off into nowhere, and nothing is ever resolved. These are not proper conversations. Now, there is an argument, maybe that's deliberate by Rooney, and I'll come back to that. But the idea that that you know, these are conversations between friends or with friends, because these conversations are empty, half-formed, what fills the gap? Well, it's judgment. These characters are very judgmental of one another. So the very first mention of Nick by Bobby is he's a trophy husband. They haven't even seen him yet, but, you know, because he's in magazines and stuff with or without Melissa, straight away, instant judgment. They've not met him. He's a trophy husband. I could hear that Bobby said this with an ironic smile because she was aware that she was showing off. I was jealous, but I also felt that because I hadn't seen the play, I was party to something Bobby didn't know about. She still saw Nick as a background figure with no significance other than as Melissa's husband. If I told her that I just sent him an email thanking him for the tickets, she wouldn't understand that I was showing off too, because to her, Nick was just a function of Melissa's unhappiness and uninteresting in his own right. It seemed unlikely she would see the play now, and I couldn't think of any other way to impress her with Nick's personal significance. When I mentioned that he was planning to come and see us perform sometime soon, she just asked if that meant Melissa would come too. So as I say, grudging friends. Melissa is allied, Bobby is allied to Melissa, and Francis is allied to Nick. And therefore Bobby is very disparaging of Nick, and Melissa is very disparaging of Francis, to the point where she says, and once she's discovered the affair between her husband and Francis, so this is Melissa's instant judgment on Francis, which we don't get to until towards the end of the book. "You've treated me with total contempt," said Melissa, "and I don't mean just because of Nick. The first time you came to our house, you just looked around like, here's something bourgeois and embarrassing that I'm going to destroy. And I mean, you took such enjoyment in destroying it. None of that was described, by the way. This is again, that conversation never took place. This is Melissa filling in the gaps of a conversation that should have taken place but never did. Suddenly, I'm looking around at my own fucking house, thinking, is this sofa ugly? Is it kitsch to drink wine? And things I felt good about before started to make me feel pathetic." That's what I mean, you know, instant judgment of Francis, but equally, she's not done any work, like I said before, Melissa has not done the work on herself. If she's suddenly feeling insecure about her own house because a 20-year-old who at this point is not sleeping with her husband and is not making her feel insecure about her marriage, is casting judgment as a, you know, an anti-capitalist Marxist, which we've already debunked, but anyway, and all of a sudden she's now questioning her own taste. I don't buy it. Do the work on yourself. And then once she's discovered that obviously Nick has betrayed her, then not illegitimately she's very harsh on him. And this is in an email to Francis. Equally, if you're sleeping with him because you believe his affection proves you to be a good person, or even a smart or attractive person, you should know that Nick is not primarily attracted to good-looking or morally worthy people. He likes partners who take complete responsibility for all his decisions, that's all. You will not be able to draw a sustainable sense of self-respect from this relationship you're in. I'm sure you find his total acquiescence charming now, but over the course of a marriage it actually becomes exhausting. So, you know, I understand the need for revenge on one's husband who's been unfaithful, although Melissa's also previously been unfaithful. And, you know, she's attacking Francis by attacking her husband. I get it. But, again, do the work. These people need to do the work on themselves. And talking of revenge, this is one of the most bizarre revenge fantasies I've ever sort of seen in a book. So, Melissa's pissed with Bobby over something. I stared at Melissa. Francis is pissed with Bobby over something. I stared at Melissa and a shiver of nausea ran over my skin. I hated that Bobby had been emailing her. It made me want to step on her foot very hard and then look in her face and deny that I had done it. So the sum total of her revenge fantasy is to step on somebody's foot and then brazenly deny that they've done it. I mean, when Putin's FSG agents come over and poison an ex-KGB officer who'd come over to the British, bringing his secrets, and then back on Russian TV, the two agents who were responsible for poisoning him say they'd gone to a town in the UK called Salisbury where this guy lived because they wanted to see the famous crooked spire on the cathedral. You know, that's brazen. That's a revenge fan. You know, that's the notion of doing something and then denying you're doing it. Her version is like a 6-year-old bloody child. Hi, sorry about that. I've been talking for so long, my video ran out of juice. So I've probably slightly lost the thread, so you'll have to forgive me. We are nearly at the end, I can promise you that. Okay, so I was talking about how the title is Misleading, Conversations with Friends, because as I feel, it's partial conversations with grudging friends. And on page 303, so about 20 pages before the end of the book, this is directly quoted. We developed a joke about it which was meaningless to everyone, including ourselves. What is a friend? We would say humorously. What is a conversation? I can't help feeling that that's Rooney talking, that she's got to this point 300 pages later, having asked the question in the title of Conversation with Friends. She's not able to answer her own question. She doesn't know what conversations are, and she, you know, the notion of friends. I appreciate this is a book about the shifting nature of boundaries between friends, lovers, relationships. It's not quite as sort of hard-boundaried, hard-bordered as it was in, say, my parents' generation, the 50s and the 60s. And thank goodness for that, you know, that we have come a long way, that it is much more fluid, that there's sort of a fluidity of sexual preference in this book. But even that is problematic because we're told that Bobby and Francis are ex-partners, but we're never privy, even in flashback, we're never privy to what the nature of that sort of physical attraction was. So that when all the heterosexual stuff is portrayed here between Francis and Nick, we've got nothing to compare it to in terms of, you know, what Francis' psychosexual psyche is. We don't know what drives her, what she's attracted to, because here it's all about her, you know, her having this heterosexual relationship, and we have no information on the previous lesbian relationship. So, yes, she is fluid in her preferences, but in terms of the treatment of that within this book, it's unbalanced because we only get the hetero stuff, we don't get the lesbian stuff. Anyway, so I've slightly deviated from talking about sort of performative. So, as I say, you know, these are half-baked conversations, and into the gap, as I've said, comes judgmentalism and, you know, quite sort of acerbic one-upmanship. But the other thing that comes into it is the performative nature of relationships and of conversations. So I've got quite a few examples of this. Again, many of them early on, which one has to assume is to set the tone of this book, to set the world of this book. Right away, I decided to remember everything about her home so I could describe it to our other friends later, and Bobby could agree. So it's that thing of, you know, recording the stuff that she's encountering for the first time, which is the interior of Melissa's home, but not to admire it or to even sort of reject it, you know, as bourgeois or whatever, which is what she's accused of right towards the end of the book by Melissa. It's so she can file it away and talk about it with her other friends, and Bobby could agree. So, as I say, it's performative. It's we no longer tell anecdotes in this book. It's about gathering data for potential content, for online content, for sharing with friends. So it's, you know, rather than sort of comment to Melissa, oh, you have a beautiful house or whatever, that's more important that I tell my friends because Melissa's a minor celebrity. And there's more of the same of this sort of stuff. Beside her, I looked bored and interesting. I tried to imagine my name appearing in a profile piece in a serif font with thick stems. I decided I would try harder to impress Melissa next time we met. This is on page 9. So we have no idea that you know, what Melissa thinks of Francis or what Francis thinks of Melissa. I decided I would try harder to impress Melissa next time we met. Yes, because you want something. You want this profile piece. You want this puff piece in a magazine. So it's not only performative, it's transactional. Relationships are transactional. And there is always an element of transactional relationship, but relationships aren't only transactional. This is, again, another bizarre sort of psychological makeup or psychological tick. So she's in the early stages of sort of fantasising about Nick. And they're having these long, I don't think they've had sex at this point, but they're having these long exchanges over email late at night. At home, I watched YouTube clips of his film and TV appearances. He had once played the young father of a kidnapped victim in an episode of a long-running crime drama. And in one scene, he broke down and cried in the police station. That was the clip I watched most often. He cried exactly the way I imagined he would in real life, hating himself for crying, but hating himself so much that it only made him cry harder. This is the kicker. I found that if I watched this clip before we spoke at night, I tended to be more sympathetic towards him. I mean, it's like she has to sort of puff herself up, not puff herself up, but get herself going, get her juices flowing enough that she can hold this typed conversation over email with him by the performative act of watching him cry. That if she didn't watch these videos, she wouldn't be able to communicate with him. I mean, how bizarre is that? It's so surface, so superficial. You know, that it's like, by watching him cry on this video, it's like an explainer video for emotions. It's utterly bizarre to my mind. He put his hand on my waist and I felt my whole body lift toward him. I touched the buckle of his belt and said, "We can sleep together if you want, but you should know I'm only doing it ironically." Again, performative. For later, you know, distribution to friends and family. It's not, you know, not being in the moment, but preserving it for posterity to roll out as, again, not an anecdote, but as data, as content, dishing the dirt. So she's at a theatre and Nick's supposed to be joining her, and Nick is late. Finally, Nick appeared out of a door on stage left, but buttoning up his shirt. I felt a string of self-consciousness, as if the audience had all turned at this moment to observe my reaction. So it's all about her. she's in an audience, which automatically means it's not about members of the audience, unless it's one of those, postmodernist plays. It's not about the audience, it's about the play. And Nick, this sort of reasonably well-known actor, enters the auditorium to be an audience member. And she imagines that everyone turns to look at him, which makes sense because he's a minor celebrity. But if they're doing that, they're not. She imagines they're not doing it to look at him, but to look at her, for what her reaction is to Nick entering. Now, yes, there may be a bit of paranoia and a bit of anxiety that people will realise that she's got this crush on him, that there's she's worried about sort of the revelation. But the way it's written, it seems to be all, she's made it all about her. And it isn't. They all laughed at that except Nick. I knew at this point that I was being interpreted as some kind of vaguely disruptive sexual presence for the sake of their joke. Okay. It didn't bother me, and in fact I thought about how funny I could make it sound in an email. Again, not living in the moment, but calculating the currency, the value of this when she tells it later on social media or in her emails, whatever it is. And it's like people who go to concerts or go to sports events and they spend the entire duration of the event not watching what's going on the field or on the stage, but watching it through the viewfinder because they're bloody recording it, and they will only really experience it when they replay it at home through the digital screen. And this is why I wonder about this book. She is called the most important millennial writer writing for a generation of millennials. And I'm asking myself the question, because I'm outside of the millennial, cohort. I'm asking myself the question, why is she so popular amongst her peers? Because as represented here, they're all pretty unpleasant. They're performative, they're judgmental, they shirk emotions, they run away from real emotions. It's not a flattering portrait. So on the one hand, is her audience just grateful that they've been seen, that these are books for younger adult readers, not young adult, but 20-year-old somethings who are not basically represented in the contemporary literary world? So are they just grateful for being seen? Or is Rooney chastising them and criticising them, saying, look, it doesn't pay to be unemotional, it doesn't pay to be judgmental, it doesn't pay to be performative, it doesn't pay to live your life through the mediation of digital screens? Is it in fact a critical book of her millennial sort of fan base? In which case they don't seem to be picking up on it because she's incredibly popular. I don't understand. I don't know which of those it is. It leaves me bemused, to be honest. But that's sort of the only overview I was able to take away from this book is she's not writing for me. Well, that's fine. She doesn't have to write for me. Although I don't think writers should be writing for exclusive groups of people. They should try and make their work as universal as possible. I mean, you're not going to please everyone all the time. And there are certain power dynamics within any portrayal, any representation of people in art. And obviously there's lots of people who are marginalised and not represented. So there are all those all that sort of political dynamic going on. But I really don't understand what she was trying to do with this book. And just to sort of some odds and ends to clear up, things that bits I wanted to pick up in my earlier sections and I just missed because there were so many. So this is again back to the sort of quick to judgment, but also the calculating nature of relationship, the transactional nature. So this is very early in the book. So Frances has met Melissa. I'd wanted Melissa to take an interest in me because we were both writers, but instead she didn't seem to like me. Quick to judgment. And I wasn't even sure I liked her. Quick to judgment. We're on page 20 of a book that starts on page 3. I didn't have the option not to take her seriously because she had published a book, which proved that lots of other people took her seriously, even if I didn't. Judgmental. All these other people who take her seriously as a published writer are wrong, because that doesn't, score diddly with me. me being Francis. At 21, I had no achievements or possessions that proved I was a serious person. And yet, at 21, you feel you could disparage this slightly more established artist. Again, performative and judgmental. She does, as we know, she writes poetry, Frances, but in the book she actually is so moved with material that she writes a short story, and it's based on Bobby. And she doesn't tell Bobby that she's basically put her in her story. And this is always a question the writers get asked. I don't see it as a relevant question personally. You know, are your characters based on real people? Anyway, eventually it comes out in the magazine, and Bobby reads it and is furious. And I think the interpretation we're supposed to have is that it was Melissa who passed it on to Bob. Bobby was unaware of it. It was Melissa who clued her in. Anyway, so Bobby is furious and basically feels utterly betrayed by it, that their shared personal life has been sort of put in the public sphere even though in the guise of fiction. And Bobby storms off, and basically there's a break between them. And towards the end of the book, they get back together as friends, and they're trying to talk about it, about what had driven them apart. And Frances says, "I'm sorry my story hurt your feelings." No, you didn't hurt her feelings. She felt utter betrayal. Now, whether that's a right reaction on Bobby's part, it doesn't matter, because it was genuinely felt as a betrayal. And yet we get this very euphemistic, litotes, "I'm sorry my story," not "I'm sorry I hurt your feelings," but "I'm sorry my story hurt your feelings." It did more than hurt her feelings. It absolutely ravaged her feelings. And the thing is that ultimately this is a story of an extramarital affair, admittedly updated for the 21st century, as I say, with sort of more fluid sexual preferences, an acknowledgement of the muddied ambiguity between boundaries and borders between friends and lovers, but it is still basically man and woman. Do they love each other? Is it a relationship of equals, etc., etc., etc.? But this is treated by Frances, as the main voice of this book, as if she's the only person in the world this has happened to. This is all groundbreaking stuff. And of course it absolutely isn't. It's meat and drink not only of literature, but of soap opera, of any sort of mass art form. But she treats it as if it's uniquely happening to her. So Frances is tense over something. I can't remember what. She's pulling strands of her hair out and sort of dropping them on the floor. I thought, probably they won't even be there, and I'll have to come home and sweep up all these strands of hair and feel terrible. Probably nothing of import will happen in my life again, and I'll just have to sweep things up until I die. So she's gone from strands of her hair that she's pulled out and put on the floor, and it's escalated 0 to 60 into, this is what's going to happen to me for the rest of my life. I'll never, nothing of significance will ever happen in her life again. Grow up. We all live through this stuff. We may get a little bit scarred, but we make it through to the other side. But she's making it as if it's only happening to her, and it's such a dilemma, and how can she solve it? It's absolutely potty. We're the same. I went to get my jacket. I knew that no one was watching me, that no one cared what I thought I did or did, and I seemed to feel myself almost vibrating with the power of this perverse new freedom. I could scream or take my clothes off if I wanted, so I could walk in front of a bus on my way home. Who would know? Bobby wouldn't follow me. Nick wouldn't even seem to be talking to me in public. It's so over dramatic. It's so me, oh, woe is me. I can have these great freedoms and throw off all my clothes, which is, I guess, a sort of positive take on it. But she quickly switches it, or I could walk in front of a bus. Who would know? Bobby wouldn't follow me. Nick wouldn't even be seen speaking to me in public. Again, you've been rejected. You were sleeping with a married man. it didn't, you know, it proved too difficult. You split up. And it's like the world is, yeah, we all feel as though our world has collapsed, but we are eventually, as I say, we come through the other side, we put it in perspective, our world may have collapsed, but the world itself hasn't collapsed, it's still there. You know, these are broken people. All four of the people in here are broken people. They're not whole. And the sort of conclusion of the book, I'm not saying that Rooney feels this, but certainly this is Frances's state of mind, is that she wants to have her cake and eat it. You know, that she wants Nick back, and I'm not going to spoil whether that happens or not. She also wants Bobby back in a relationship, but that's, you know, that's sort of outside the purview of the novel, as I say, because we're told that they had a relationship, but they're not in one now. And part of the reason that maybe she's gone to Nick is she's trying to make Bobby jealous and get back with Bobby. Anyway, that's a reader extrapolating out, because it's not really in the book. And the point is, to want your cake and eat it will not make you whole. Because to want your cake and eat it, to want everything, is greedy, unrealistic, and you normally trampling on people to wanting your cake, getting it and eating it. It will not make you whole. It will not heal you. And it's an expression of your inner turmoil and of your brokenness. But that's the note we're left on the book. That's what Frances' character and the place that she ends up at. So we could be, you know, sympathetic for someone who has endometriosis, but we're not. We're left on this, oh, I might drift back into a relationship with Nick on the side, because my life isn't working. It wasn't working when I was with Nick. But if I get back with him, I know it still won't work, but what the hey. So the character work is weak. You know, they're all repellent characters. They claim to be one thing, but they're also the complete opposite, as in the case of no personality and ego. And they're very quick to judgment, and as I say, they're grudging. You know, it makes them out to be grudging friends, not genuine friends. There's just too much in this book that sort of undermines itself as it goes on. And as I say, ultimately, I don't know what it's trying to achieve. Is it shots fired across the bows of the millennial generation? Or is it, here you are millennials, first time in print? I mean, not literally the first time, but, you know, this is a book for you guys. This is about you. And yet it's such a negative portrayal. Such an odd reading experience. The final thing I'll say is, it's a very quick read, partly because the language is simple. So although it's 300 pages, and although I was making all these notes, I actually burned through it really quickly. We were doing it as a buddy read, 50 pages a day, which we stuck to. And I took less than an hour to read the 50 pages, which is quicker than my normal speed for 50 pages. It would take over an hour, probably closer to an hour and a half. So in that sense, it wasn't a great burden on me. I mean, I felt very put out about what I was reading, but in terms of the inundation of my time, it wasn't. So that's about the most positive thing I can say about it. I won't be reading Ms. Rooney again. Just to say, if you haven't seen my video, why I picked this up in the first place, the novel I've written is called Solipsistic Conversations with Close Friends, obviously echoing this. And in that other video, I talk about why, and not why in terms of my book, but why because I've used that title. I felt I had to read this because I could well get asked questions as to, well, why have you echoed Rooney's? And if I hadn't read Rooney's book, I'd be up shit creek with no paddle. It's worth saying, which I didn't say in that video, and I wish I had now, that of course, if my book gets a publishing deal, the publishers may say, oh, we don't like the title, change it. So all this may have been in vain. But anywho, so my book, as I say, is called Solipsistic Conversations with Close Friends. And as I was reading this, I was sort of, well, obviously, you know, my book is a million miles removed from this, which is what I had hoped. But by the end, I thought, well, actually, my book shares one thing in common with this. I think these characters are solipsistic. I think they go on as if no one else in the world exists. And if they do, they're as objects. They're only there for their own pleasure and entertainment. That these characters are in so far up themselves that they are sort of solipsistic. So there is that one bridging gap to my own novel. I mean, the reason my book is called that is because solipsism is actually explored. The solipsism of death, in this case. Anywho, that really is all I've got to say in this book. Yeah, I welcome your comments. I welcome the defenders of the book. I welcome millennials to answer the question of how they regard this book. But of course, it's not restricted to millennials. Anyone can comment. 1 star. Till next time. Oh, I will also say that I have read other books in the interim, and I will be posting, I think, a more positive review of a spread of books hard on the heels of this. Till next time, which will be that video. Thanks very much.